Welcome to another episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Make sure you follow and subscribe on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and you can shop online at ntxvinyl.com if you're looking for new or pre-order albums. Today's topic, 5 albums that changed the course of my life. This is kind of a big topic and honestly a little bit daunting to think about. It's hard to pinpoint just 5 records out of all of these and tons of others that I don't own that changed my life. That's a big thing to commit to saying, right? But I can honestly say music is that important to me and in my household and my family. It kind of dictates a lot of what we do, and it's always on, and really, especially with NTX Vinyl, drives a lot of our activity, and it's an amazing thing that definitely impacts our life on a daily, if not hourly basis, right? So when I think about 5 albums that changed the course of my life, I really had to go back and go, okay, what were my first impressions? Like what really impacted me early on that then set me down a path year after year to continue to discover more. So tried to think of those albums that were the initial glimpses of, again, impacted me personally that would later continue to kind of have a ripple effect, right? The first album I think of, Van Halen 1984. Absolutely iconic album. And honestly, the album cover itself is what I remember most. So in 1984, I was 6 years old. So I don't necessarily remember the music of Van Halen 1984 from that early. I do remember the cover, and that's because I have older siblings, specifically an older brother who was really into Van Halen. And this album in particular, I remember being in his room. He had a turntable, and I remember spinning 45s with him and things like that. But I wasn't that into it. I was too young, right? Or for the most part, too young. Um, but this album in particular, I remember the album cover because it's obviously very iconic, and you had the smokes, which are like, you knew that wasn't supposed to, a thing that you should put on an album cover. Back then, you could get away with it though, and got these wings on a baby. It was just very kind of cryptic in a way. You didn't really understand it. And as a kid, it was eye-catching to say the least. And then came the music. You've got Hot for Teacher, you've got Jump, you've got Panama. Those songs were huge. And so as I was really starting to get exposed to popular music, I think at the time, mid 80s music. This was one of the first ones I remember. I didn't own it back then. Again, I was too young. I was probably, 7, 8 years old when I remember being exposed to this, especially the singles, Panama and Jump and even Hot for Teacher. Those were just huge. And so to this day, when I thought of albums that changed my life, this was one of the first visions that came into my head from being, a youngster and back at our childhood home, right? And so Van Halen Jump, Van Halen 1984, just iconic to me. And to this day, one of my favorite Van Halen records. I would put this up there with the self-titled record, honestly, is for me, from an impact perspective. I love all of the Van Halen records, the early stuff, and even into the Sammy Hagar era. But this one in particular definitely had to top the list as the first one because it's one of my earliest memories visually of this album cover. Second on the list, if you're going to go from Van Halen, I kind of went backwards on this one, and that's because, again, I was really at the mercy of getting exposed to music through my older siblings. And I distinctly remember the first time I heard Led Zeppelin 1. It was coming out of my brother's car. And I remember thinking, what is that? Like, I was somewhat familiar with music at that time, again, into the mid to late 80s, but I hadn't been exposed to classic rock of this nature. Like, I heard it on the radio, I'm sure, but never really knew the artist, and it all kind of blended together because I was a young kid not paying attention. But I did pay attention when I heard this, the mystique around this album, the power, the aggression. It just really made an impression on me, and to this day, I still love this record. It's not even my favorite Zeppelin record. Like, I would probably put Led Zeppelin 3 or maybe even Physical Graffiti at the top. But this one, as far as impacting my life, definitely set me on a path where I would appreciate classic rock and just rock and roll in general from beginning to, current day. And so this was another one as I thought about, like, what are those starting points for me from an influence perspective? Van Halen 1984 and Led Zeppelin 1, those were two of, if not the first two albums that I really recall having an impact on me, and I think in the end have put me in a place where I am now, sitting in a chair behind this wall of all these records, right? So Led Zeppelin 1, number 2 on my list. Now we get more into a little bit of more modern, because I'm in junior high, or right about to go into junior high, and I'm inching towards high school, and that's when the CD makes its appearance, right around 1991. You were really cool if you didn't have cassettes anymore and you had a CD player, right? So I saved up my money, probably sold some baseball cards or something if I had to guess. Got my mom to take me to Walmart or Target, wherever it was, and I had $100 or something around there. Bought my first boom box, and I had enough money for one CD. And back then, CDs were, before they got discounted, they were $18, $20 for a CD in the long box. And the CD I bought was Black Crowes' Southern Harmony Musical Companion. At the time, the band was just, they had the first record already, which I had kind of heard of in passing. But when Remedy came out and hit the radio, it was a huge single off this album, huge debut single. It really spoke to me. And so when I was in the Walmart that day or whatever and bought that boom box, this was the one I picked out. And so it's always held a special place for me, because it was really the first physical media that I ever bought with my real money. I mean, I had cassettes before that of, I was into some hip hop, and I was listening to country and a little bit of rock and roll here and there on cassette, but mostly it was stuff that was passed down or dubbed for me. And maybe if I did have a couple, it was stuff my parents had bought for me, obviously. But by the time I was, getting into junior high, you got to have your own money to a certain extent, and saved up for that boombox and bought this record. And to this day, it's one of my favorites. I love the Crowes, always have. Sting Me, Remedy, Thorn in My Pride, probably my favorite Crow song ever. Bad Luck Blue Eyes is incredible. Sometimes Salvation, Hotel Illness. I'm just naming my morning song. I'm naming the whole track list. Absolutely incredible record. To me, this is, my generation's Allman Brothers, my generation's Grateful Dead, my generation's Lynyrd Skynyrd, Led Zeppelin, all those bands. You can hear them all packed into this album and this band, and I love that about them. And for me at the time when it came out, that's the way I felt. I'm like, man, I knew Led Zeppelin by that point. I knew a lot of classic rock bands. I was like, this is a band that's hitting right now in America that is doing the same thing those bands were doing. And it just really, really overwhelmed me and set me on a path to go buy a lot more CDs, I can tell you, and even get into records, which I did just a couple years after this, right? So I didn't get this one until years later. But Black Crowes were huge, still are for me. I only had that one CD for a couple weeks, I think, and then I remember there was a party at my house, my childhood house. I was still young, early junior high, but my brother and sister were older, and there was a party. And during this party, they had a CD on my brother's stereo playing, and on repeat the whole time. And that was Pearl Jam's 10, and that was the first time I ever heard it. And I just remember going, what is this? And why is it playing over and over and over? By the end of the party, I was like, man, this is really good. Went to school the next day or that next week, and I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who I knew was into music and I think had just gotten a CD player as well, so we were connecting on that level. And I had told him, I just got my boombox and I had my Black Crowes CD, and he said, the next CD you need to buy is this one. I said, I just heard that. It was on repeat at the party my brother and sister were having at our house. So this was the second CD I bought. I didn't get the record till a couple years later. It didn't even come out on vinyl till a couple years later. But Pearl Jam 10, and specifically Pearl Jam is my band. I know a lot of people feel that way about certain artists and even about Pearl Jam, but this is the one that set me on a path where I was like, oh man, this is it. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm going to focus on music. And it took me a while to get there, but after a couple years, I had morphed into that. For a lot of people, it could be Nevermind by Nirvana. It could be Dirt by Alice in Chains or Bad Motorfinger. There's a lot of incredible albums that came out during that period. For me, this is the one that resonated the most. I love all of those bands, but of all of them, Pearl Jam is at the top of the list for me personally. I'm a huge collector. In fact, I've got a whole video on my YouTube of my entire Pearl Jam collection if you want to check it out. And so again, for me, this was just huge. It was the second CD I ever bought, and it just showed me a kind of raw aesthetic that I hadn't really felt before. And it was just, I just connected with it. What can I say? And to this day, still connected, still very connected. So, last but not least, and probably, or most certainly, the most obscure artist on this list, and an album that doesn't even exist on vinyl, so I can't show it to you, but this is a single from the album. The band is Tripping Daisy. The track is the opening track from their debut album, Bill. This is the My Umbrella single. Like I mentioned, it doesn't exist on vinyl yet. It's going to. The fine people at Good Records, which is a label and store based here in Dallas, they are going to be reissuing Tripping Daisy's debut album, Bill, on vinyl for the first time ever. I believe in 2022 or maybe 2023. They haven't given a specific date, but it's definitely coming. And the reason why this album or Bill, this is the single, but the reason why Bill was so critical to me because it was my introduction to local music. That's a big difference. It's one thing to go to a big rock show at an arena or a big festival or something, get exposed to that. But when you go into a club that holds 100 or 200 or 500 people, to feel that energy and to be that close to it, that absolutely changed the course of my life. The reason why I picked up a guitar and became a musician, and the reason why I'm here today, is because of a band like Tripping Daisy and because of their album Bill, which was my initial exposure to local music, getting to go to local clubs on a weekly basis and see bands like this. It was an absolute game changer. We didn't have the scene that Seattle had, that was breaking into the mainstream nationally, even internationally. But we had handfuls of bands that were really making waves, Tripping Daisy being one of them, Toadies, Reverend Horton Heat, bands like that that did get national exposure and some international exposure. But being able to see them at the very beginning in small clubs was an absolute game changer. It undoubtedly altered the course of my life, and I'm forever grateful for a band like Tripping Daisy and for an album like Bill, and I cannot wait to own it on vinyl. Really looking forward to that. The rest of their catalog has been reissued and is being reissued as well by Good Records. If you Google Good Records Dallas, you can find them and check that out. But really looking forward to Bill. It's the first one. It's the debut album. It came out independently on Dragon Street, and then they got signed to Dragon Street Records, a small independent label here that was based in Dallas. Then they got signed to Island, and then with their next album, I'm an Elastic Firecracker, they had a hit song called I Got a Girl that was on MTV. And so they did get some exposure, but for the most part, a very underground band unless you're from Dallas, and then it's a very iconic and important band, and one that I often talk a lot here on my channel. So check it out if you're not familiar with it. You can stream Bill and their whole catalog. So that's 5 albums that changed the course of my life. Was not an easy list to make. There was a couple that were on the cusp. I could have easily expanded this to 10 albums, but I tried to keep it succinct and tried to really think about those albums that really impacted me in those early kind of formidable years where you're very impressionable. And those were the kind of the 5 I landed on. I think that's a pretty good list. That if you had to explain to someone my musical taste, you could pretty much push those 5 albums to them, and they'd have a pretty good understanding of this wall behind me and kind of where I'm coming from personally. So that's my 5 albums that changed the course of my life. I'd love to hear yours, so listen in the comments. It's always interesting to see what albums really have an impact on people, whether it's mainstream stuff or some obscure albums, whatever it may be. So I would love to check that out, so let us know in the comments. Again, my name is G.I. Sanders. This has been Talking About Records. Really appreciate your time and hope you tune in again.